This episode is brought to you by Cisco Educational Premium.
The subatomic realm can be a perplexing place, but you would assume that we've studied atoms long enough to at least comprehend their most fundamental properties. Things like how large a proton is, and based on several experiments, we scientists believe that we have a pretty good grasp on it. However, an ingenious 2010 experiment returned with a very dissimilar number for the size of protons, challenging what before we knew. After nearly a decade of re-examination, we now believe that we have resolved what is known as the proton radius mystery. Before we delve into the details of the latest findings, I must correct the information about atoms. Most of the things you were taught about them in high school, if you are fortunate to attend, are oversimplified. The proton itself is not a smooth billiard ball, but more like a cloud of quarks held together by gluons. The quarks that compose a proton give it a positive charge. That positive charge's threshold can be considered as the proton's size. For decades, we have used two approaches to determine the radius of a proton's boundary. One method involves directing electrons at atoms, often hydrogen, which in its simplest form consists of a single proton in the nucleus, with one orbiting electron. By observing how electrons interact with the nucleus, scientists can identify where the proton's positive charge begins to diminish. The other method measures the energy required to excite an atom's electron from one state to the next, and once again, hydrogen is often the preferred atom for this investigation. In its lower energy state, hydrogen's electron does not merely orbit around the proton but actually spends some of its time in the proton. Because electrons carry a negative charge, when one is inside a proton, the proton's positive charge pulls it in opposing directions, reducing the electrical attraction between them. Consequently, the energy needed to excite the electron to its next energy level is decreased. Thus, the hypothesis suggests that the larger the proton, the more time an electron will reside within it, resulting in weaker atomic binding. By measuring the energy required for an electron inside a proton to transition to the next energy state, we can reduce the size of protons. Over the years, these two methods more or less agreed that the proton's radius was approximately 0.867 femtometers, and all was well until about a decade ago when someone had a brilliant idea of substituting hydrogen's electron with a muon. Muons are similar to electrons in every aspect except they are 207 times more massive. This added weight means that the muon spend more time inside the proton, making it switch to a higher energy state, millions of times more sensitive to the proton size than the electron is in regular hydrogen. By measuring the proton using muonic hydrogen, they came back with a result 4% smaller than previously accepted size, a difference that is not negligible. The sensitivity of this method was too much to ignore. So we got a problem with our previous measurements of, or was this hint of something more tantalizing? Maybe muons and protons interacted in ways that made protons shrink, or muons behaved somewhat differently than electrons. Maybe the discrepancies would reveal some heretofore unknown physics or even new elementary particles. This brings us to September 2019 when scientists in New York University in Toronto announced the result of an experiment that used regular electronic hydrogen like most experiments before. Like those past experiments, they excited an electron into a higher energy state. Only this time, the scientists used a high precision measuring technique called frequency offset separated oscillator fields, which they modified for this experiment. Their results showed that the proton's radius was around 0.833 femtometers and consistent with the muonic hydrogen experiment from 2010. So the results are bittersweet. It looked like the discrepancy of protons size was just down to measurement error and not a hint to some undiscovered realm of particle physics. But at least the proton size is finally settled. If you imagine a chair that is a billion times larger, its atom would be the size of melons. But even so, the nucleus at the center would still be far too small to see, and so would the electrons as they dance around it. So why don't our fingers just pass through the atoms? And why doesn't light pass through the gaps? To explain why, we must look at the electrons. Unfortunately, contrary to the popular science, electrons do not actually orbit the center of atom like planets around the sun. Instead, think of electrons like a swarm of bees or birds, where the individual motions are too fast to track, but you still see the shape of the overall swarm. In fact, electrons dance. There's no better word for it, but it's not random dancing. It's more like a ballroom dancing, where they move in set patterns following steps laid down by a mathematical equation, the Schrödinger equation, named after Erwin Schrödinger. These patterns can vary. Some are slow, whereas some are fast. Each electron keeps to the same pattern. It may change to another as long as another electron is not doing that pattern already. No two electrons in an atom can do the same step. This rule is called the Pauli exclusion principle. Although electrons never tire, moving up to a faster step does stack energy. When an electron moves down to a slower pattern, it loses energy, which it gives out. So when energy in form of light falls on an electron, it absorbs some of the energy and moves up to a higher, faster dance pattern. A light beam won't get far through our chair since the electrons in all the atoms are eager to grab energy from the light. After a very short while, they lose this gain energy, perhaps as light again. Changes in the patterns of absorbed and reflected light gives reflections and colors. So we see the chair as solid. So why does the chair feel solid? It feels solid because of the dancing electrons. If you touch the chair, then the electrons from the atoms in your fingers become close to the electrons in the chair's atoms. As the electrons in one atom get close enough to the nucleus of another, the patterns of their dance is changed. This is because an electron in one energy level of one nucleus cannot do the same around the other. That slot is already taken by one of its own electron. The newcomer must step into an occupied, more energetic row. The energy has to be supplied not by light this time, but by the force from your probing finger. So pushing just two atoms close to each other takes energy. Trying to push all the chair's atoms and finger atoms together demands an awful lot of energy, more than your muscles can supply. You feel that as resistance to your finger, which is why and how the chair feels solid to your touch.
Cisco Educational Premium is a section of Cisco Educationals with content that is not hosted here. There are episodes ranging from long to short videos. Remember those good old shots of ours? They are there. So do we get there? Use the link on screen or in the description or in the pinned comment below. Enjoy yourself. And I will see you in the next episode of Cisco Educationals.
Yeah.